Victoria Blackwell looked at Nolan Pierce's work jacket, and then she pulled her chair to another table. In front of her clients, the chief executive announced that she did not dine with hired help and told the manager to seat him alone. Nolan did not argue. He set his napkin down and asked whether Eleanor Blackwell knew about this. Victoria laughed and said her mother would never invite a man like him. Then Eleanor walked in, placed a genetic testing envelope in the middle of the table, and said, "You should read this before you insult him one more time. If you enjoy stories where contempt collapses into justice, stay with Nolan through tonight and follow along for the ending he earned. I want to begin 4 hours earlier, in a service corridor beneath the Blackwell Grand Manhattan, because that is where the man everyone would later argue about was spending his evening." Nolan Pierce was 43 years old, kneeling in front of an electrical panel with a flashlight in his teeth while a chief engineer explained why the ballroom climate system had been cycling itself into a shutdown for 2 straight days. There was a charity gala in that room in 36 hours, 900 guests, a mayor, 3 network cameras, and a general manager who had already drafted the apology letter he prayed he would never send. Nolan found the fault in a control relay swapped by a vendor who never updated the sequencing logic, and he rewrote that logic himself on a laptop balanced on a laundry cart. When the air handlers finally settled into a steady breath, 2 housekeepers who had stopped to watch clapped once each. I mention it because in a few hours a woman would look at the dust on his shoes and decide she knew everything about him. Nolan owned a company called Pierce Operations Group, and it was not the kind of company that bought naming rights to anything. There were 19 employees, a leased floor in New Jersey, and a client list of luxury hotel groups who called him the way a hospital calls a surgeon, which is to say quietly and only when something was bleeding. He drove a 7-year-old sedan and wore an $80 watch because it survived being banged against pipe racks. He had a 15-year-old daughter named Lila who sent him photographs of her chemistry homework with the caption "Help," and a wife who had died 4 years earlier in a hospital room he still could not drive past without changing lanes. 3 weeks before that evening, a woman had called him from a number he did not know, and she spoke with the strangest mixture of formality and fear he had ever heard in an adult voice. She said her name was Eleanor Blackwell, that she was 67, honorary chairwoman of Blackwell Hospitality Group, and that she had spent a long time looking for a man born in a hospital in western Pennsylvania on a February morning in 1983. She said she was not calling about business. Nolan sat down on the edge of his desk and listened to his own heartbeat get loud. He had been adopted at 11 days old by a machinist and a school secretary who loved him well and told him the truth early, and he had never gone looking because he had decided long ago that a man who was given away should not go begging for an explanation. They met twice, both times in small restaurants no photographer would ever bother to watch, and both times Nolan refused everything she offered except conversation. She showed him sealed records unsealed by court petition, a chain of paperwork running from a maternity ward to an adoption agency, to a family named Pierce, and a photograph of herself at 19, with a face that was unmistakably a softer version of his own. He looked at it a long time, then told her that a name on a document was not a mother, and that he would not build anything on a resemblance. He asked for a legal genetic test at an independent laboratory, and she agreed so quickly that he understood she had been hoping he would. 4 days before the dinner she wrote, "I need you there tonight, not as a contractor." What Nolan did not know, and what I knew from the moment the invitations went out, was that Blackwell Hospitality was 6 days from signing an expansion agreement worth $420 million with an investment group represented by a careful man named Preston Kingsley. Victoria Blackwell, 39 years old and chief executive for 2 years and 4 months, had designed that evening the way a director designs a curtain call. The private restaurant on the 54th floor had been closed to all other guests. There were place cards in hand-lettered ink, a sommelier flown up from a property in Charleston, and a seating chart that Victoria had reviewed twice, which is why she noticed immediately that her mother had added one name she did not recognize. She had assumed it was a courtesy to some retired regional director. She had not asked, because asking would have meant admitting there was something in her own company she did not already know. So when the elevator opened at 7 minutes past 7, and a man walked out in a canvas work jacket with a laminated contractor badge still clipped to the pocket, Victoria's entire understanding of the evening organized itself instantly around a mistake. She saw the jacket, she saw the cheap watch, she saw the fine gray dust of a mechanical room still ghosting the seams of his shoes, and she crossed the room herself rather than let a hostess handle it, which I want you to notice, because it was the one moment that night when her energy might have gone anywhere. She said, politely, that the restaurant was closed for a private function and that the service elevator was around the corner. Nolan said he understood, and then he took Eleanor's printed invitation out of his inside pocket and held it where she could read her own mother's signature. Victoria read it twice. Her expression did not soften. It hardened into something more efficient, because a mistake she could fix was better than a fact she had missed. She told him her mother was sometimes too kind to the staff. She said it lightly, with a small smile, the way people say cruel things when they have decided the other person is not equipped to hear them. Nolan answered that it was possible Eleanor had invited him for a different reason, and I watched her decide, in that half-second, that he was a man reaching for importance he had not earned. She asked what his role was, and he told her he ran an operations consultancy, and she said, with the faint patience of someone correcting a child's grammar, that this still made him a contractor. The hostess arrived with a place card, and Victoria took it without looking, turned it over once, and told the restaurant manager quietly not to seat Mr. Pierce at the primary table. Nolan watched a small piece of cardstock with his name on it disappear into an apron pocket. The guests arrived in the next 11 minutes, and in the order that always tells you the truth about a company. Daniel Huxley came first. The chief operating officer, 22 years with Blackwell, a man whose face was permanently arranged into pleasant neutrality. Marissa Caldwell came next, a board member who had run 2 airlines and did not laugh at things that were not funny. Preston Kingsley came last with a leather folder under his arm and a habit of watching a room for 90 seconds before saying anything. Nolan knew all 3 names from email chains and had met none of them because every engagement had been routed through a procurement portal and a middle manager and a signature that was not his. This is the part people miss about how invisibility functions. It is almost never a conspiracy. It is a workflow. Victoria began the evening well. She was, I should be fair, genuinely excellent at the visible part of her job, and for 9 minutes she was charming about the Charleston property and precise about occupancy forecasts and generous about her father's memory. Then she looked across the room, saw Nolan standing near the window with a glass of water he had poured himself, and something in her needed him accounted for out loud. She raised her voice just enough to gather the table and asked how long he had been doing maintenance work. Nolan said he did not do maintenance, that he ran a firm that redesigned operating systems for hotels in distress, and that he had spent the afternoon in this building keeping the ballroom from closing. Victoria said, "So, a contractor," and let the word sit there like a coaster under a wet glass. Marissa Caldwell put her wine down without drinking any of it. The service captain approached with the seating chart Eleanor had prepared, and he did the thing that well-trained people do when 2 authorities conflict, which is to speak to the lesser risk. He asked Nolan to follow him to the seat at the far end of the primary table, and he had actually pulled the chair back 3 inches when Victoria said his name. She told him to move Mr. Pierce to the deuce by the service station. The captain hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat, long enough for everyone in that room to register that he knew it was wrong, and then he said, "Of course, madam," because he had a daughter in college and a mortgage in Queens and no illusions about who signed his reviews. Nolan looked at that small table near the swinging doors, 2 feet from a rack of water pitchers, and he did not move yet. He asked her, evenly, whether her mother knew she had changed the list. Victoria said she was the chief executive and did not require her mother's approval for a seating diagram. He asked whether she wanted to know why Eleanor had invited him before she decided where he belonged. Victoria said this was a dinner for executives and partners, and then she said the sentence that I believe she would have paid a great deal to unsay, though at the time she thought it was rather elegant. Some rooms have to be earned. Nobody at that table mocked him. That was the worst part. 6 accomplished adults looked at their bread plates while a woman moved a man to the corner, and their silence did the work that no insult could have done alone. Nolan could have left. He understood fully that leaving was the cleanest available act, and that he had exactly enough money and reputation to make it cost her something. He thought about Lila, who was at that moment sending him a photograph of a burned grilled cheese, captioned "I have failed us," and he thought about which version of this evening he wanted his daughter to learn from. Then he remembered Eleanor's request, made across a table in a diner in Fort Lee with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Whatever happens, please stay until I get there." So he carried his water glass to the small table by the service station, sat down with his back straight, and thanked the busser who brought him bread. At 7:41, Nolan's phone lit against the tablecloth. The message was from Eleanor, 5 words long, and he read it 3 times. "The results have arrived. I'm coming." She did not say what the results said. She did not say whether she had opened them. Nolan set the phone face down, looked at the New York skyline through glass that was cold enough to fog where he breathed on it, and understood that in some number of minutes he was going to find out whether he had a mother, in a restaurant, at a table for 2, with a napkin on his lap. He felt his pulse in his throat. He also, and he was not proud of this, felt a very small and very human curiosity about what Victoria Blackwell's face was going to do. Victoria stood and lifted her glass. She had prepared 11 sentences about partnership and stewardship and the Blackwell name, and she delivered 4 of them beautifully. Then the private elevator chimed. The doors opened on a woman in a charcoal dress with silver hair pinned back, moving slowly because of a hip that had been replaced in March, carrying nothing but a small clutch and a plain white envelope held against her chest with both hands the way people carry things they have already dropped once in their imagination. Eleanor Blackwell had run this company for 19 years before her daughter did. She still controlled 31% of the voting stock, and her eyes went, immediately and without any search at all, to the empty space at the foot of the primary table where a place card should have been. Eleanor did not speak for 4 full seconds, which in a room like that is an eternity, and I have never seen a silence do more work. She looked at the gap in the seating. She looked at the sommelier who looked at the floor. Then she turned her head and found Nolan in the corner beside the water pitchers, sitting alone with a bread plate and a glass and no wine, not sulking, not glaring, not performing anything at all, simply waiting the way a man waits for a train he has been told will arrive. Something happened in her face that everyone at that table would remember later and describe differently. Marissa Caldwell told me she thought it was rage. Preston Kingsley thought it was grief. I think it was both, and I think it was also the recognition of a pattern, because 43 years earlier, a room full of well-dressed people had decided the same thing about the same person without ever meeting him. She asked, very quietly, who had changed the seating. Victoria answered immediately, and this is important because Victoria was not a coward, and never once tried to hide behind staff. She said she had. She said that she had reviewed the composition of the evening and concluded that Mr. Pierce was not an appropriate fit for the guest list, and that she had made an executive decision. Eleanor asked in what way he was not appropriate. There was a pause in which any sensible person would have stopped, and Victoria did not stop, because she had been raised in a house where retreat was worse than error. She began to list. He was not a board member, he was not an investor, he was not an executive of any material enterprise. He ran, she said, a small service company, and there was a standard for who sat at that table, and she had applied it. Daniel Huxley cleared his throat and said, "Pierce Operations Group." Eleanor asked who had kept Blackwell Grand Chicago from a 3-week shutdown after the fire suppression failure. Daniel said, "Pierce Operations." Eleanor asked who had redesigned the housekeeping and engineering handoff protocol that had cut labor overtime across the portfolio by 19%. A number that appeared, she shouted, in the second paragraph of the letter Victoria had written to investors in March. Daniel said, very quietly, "Pierce Operations," and then he added, because his conscience finally overtook his caution, that Mr. Pierce personally led all 3 engagements and had refused a success fee on the Chicago project because the failure had originated in a specification his own team had approved. For the first time that evening, Victoria Blackwell looked at the man in the corner as though he were a variable rather than a category. She recovered fast. She said that Blackwell paid those invoices, that vendors performing well was the expected outcome of a functioning procurement process, and that gratitude was not a seating criterion. It was, I will admit, a genuinely strong answer. Nolan still did not argue. Eleanor did not argue either, and that surprised everyone, including me. She simply said, "Yes, that is correct," which is why what happens next has nothing at all to do with his work. Then she walked to the primary table, set the white envelope down on the linen in the space where his place card had been, and let go of it, and I watched her fingers tremble once when they were finally empty. The envelope sat there under the light. It was ordinary, the kind that arrives with insurance paperwork, and on the upper left corner was a printed return address for a genetic diagnostics laboratory in Rockville, Maryland, and beneath that, in small blue type, 4 words, "DNA relationship analysis, confidential." Victoria read them upside down and then right side up. She asked her mother what this was. Eleanor sat down, arranged her hands in her lap, and said that it was the answer to a question she had been waiting more than 40 years to have. Marissa Caldwell set her glass on the table with unusual care. Preston Kingsley closed his leather folder. Eleanor pushed the envelope 2 inches toward her daughter, and Nolan Pierce stood up from the small table by the service station. Every head turned, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not come any closer. He said, "Madam, you should be certain you want to do this in front of everyone." He said it to protect her, which nobody in that room understood yet, and it was the single most decent thing anyone did that night. Eleanor looked at him with an expression I can only describe as astonished. Victoria looked at him with an expression that was still, even then, mostly annoyance, because she believed she was watching a contractor overstep, and because she had not yet learned that the envelope in front of her was not a weapon aimed at him. Eleanor understood exactly what he had offered her. He had given her a door, and she had perhaps 90 seconds to use it. She took a breath, turned to the guests, and said that a private family matter had arrived at an inconvenient hour, and that she would consider it a kindness if the business portion of the evening continued in the lounge for a quarter of an hour. Preston Kingsley was already reaching for his folder. He said, without any drama at all, that he would step out gladly, that whatever was in that envelope was none of his business, and that he had no interest in being present for someone's private grief. Marissa Caldwell stood. Daniel Huxley stood so fast he bumped the table, and Victoria told them to sit down. I have turned this moment over many times. because everything that happened afterward was authored here, by her, in a single sentence spoken out of pride. She believed she knew what was in that envelope, and what she believed was this: that her mother had grown fond of some charming man from the trades, that Eleanor had come here to embarrass her for how she had treated him, and that clearing the room would look like a chief executive being disciplined by her mother in front of the largest investor she had ever courted. Optics were the thing Victoria understood best in the world, and so she reached for them. She said, "If you are going to bring this to a company table, Mother, then say it at the company table." Eleanor looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "All right," and she began to talk, and her voice was steady in the specific way that costs a person everything. She said that in the summer of 1982 she was 19 years old, and her last name was not yet Blackwell. She said she was in her second year at a small college in Pennsylvania, that she fell in love with a boy who repaired instruments in the music department, and that by October she was pregnant. She said her father had a plan for her that involved a different family and a merger of 2 hotel holdings, and that when she told her parents, her mother did not cry and did not shout, but simply began making arrangements. She was sent to stay with an aunt for the spring semester. The boy was told she had transferred. Nobody in that family ever used the word pregnant out loud, not once, not in 9 months. She said the baby was a boy, born in February, 7 pounds and 11 ounces, and that she held him for 11 minutes before a woman in a cardigan took him out of the room. She said she signed the surrender documents on a clipboard in a hallway, that her father's attorney witnessed her signature, and that the records were sealed the same week. She said she married Charles Blackwell 14 months later, that she loved him eventually and genuinely, that she bore 2 children with him, and that she never told him, or anyone, because by the time she was 30 the silence had become load-bearing. Victoria's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. She had grown up in a house with portraits of 4 generations, and she had believed she knew the entire inventory of her own blood. Eleanor said that when Charles died 6 years ago, she began to look. She said it took a private researcher, 2 court petitions, a judge in Harrisburg who took 11 months to rule, and an amount of money she declined to specify, and that it produced a chain of documents ending with an adoption finalized in Erie, Pennsylvania, by a machinist and a school secretary named Pierce, and then another chain, and then a name, and then a man who lived across a river from her and had been inside her family's buildings hundreds of times. She did not say that man's name. She said only that she had found a name, and that a name is not a person, and that when she had finally sat across a table from him, he had been the one to insist on caution. Victoria turned to look at Nolan then, actually look at him, and I saw her eyes move across his face searching for a resemblance instead of a category. She asked him if this was true. Nolan said that Eleanor had found records, that records make mistakes and hope makes bigger ones, and that finding a name does not mean finding a son. He said he had asked for a legal test at an independent facility, that they had both given samples 14 days earlier at a laboratory neither of them had any relationship with, and that a third-party attorney had handled the chain of custody so no one could ever suggest a Blackwell had arranged the outcome. Then he said the thing that changed the temperature of the room. He had not read the result either. It had gone to Eleanor, and he had asked her not to tell him over the phone. I want to describe the next 90 seconds precisely because it was the most silent room I have ever been in that contained 8 people and a working kitchen. Victoria picked up the envelope. Her hands were steady. She had signed acquisition documents with those hands. She slid a butter knife under the flap because there was no letter opener, and a single folded sheet came out with a laboratory logo and a case number and 2 names in a table with columns. Nolan did not look at the paper at all. He looked at Eleanor, whose lips were moving very slightly, and I do not believe she was praying so much as bracing. Victoria's eyes went down the page to the conclusion and stopped. Then she read it again. Then she looked up, and her face was not the face she had walked in with. The document said what documents of that kind say, in language deliberately drained of feeling. It stated that based on the analysis of 24 genetic markers, the probability of maternity was 99.99%, and that the tested woman, Eleanor Margaret Blackwell, could not be excluded as the biological mother of the tested man, Nolan James Pierce. Beneath that was a line for the laboratory director's signature and a date stamp from that morning. Victoria Blackwell had spent the previous 50 minutes explaining to a room of investors and board members why the man by the service station had not earned the right to sit at her table, and she had just learned that he was her half-brother. Nobody spoke. The sommelier, God bless him, had frozen mid-pour and was still holding the bottle at an angle. Nolan sat down slowly at the small table, not because he wanted to be there, but because his legs had stopped consulting him. 43 years of a very specific kind of quiet ended in a restaurant on the 54th floor, and the first thing he felt was not joy or anger but a strange administrative flatness, the way people describe the moment after a verdict. Then Eleanor made a sound. It was small, and she covered her mouth with her hand immediately and apologized for it, which I found unbearable, that a woman would apologize for weeping over her own child. Nolan crossed the room then, and he did not embrace her, because they had not earned that yet. He put his hand flat on the table beside hers, close enough that she could reach it if she wanted to, and she did. Instead, she turned on Nolan, and I understood why. If he was a schemer, then she was merely a woman who had been rude to a schemer, and rudeness to a schemer is nearly a virtue. So she said it. She asked him what he wanted. She asked how long he had been cultivating her mother, whether he had approached her at a property, whether there had been a lawyer, and what number he had in mind. Nolan Pierce stood up, and for the first and only time that night the calm came off him, not into shouting, but into something colder and much more precise, the voice of a man who has been underestimated in a service corridor for 20 years, and has finally decided to be exact. He said he had asked for nothing. He said he had not requested equity, or money, or a title, or an introduction, or a single dollar of consideration, and that he would sign anything anyone put in front of him confirming it. He said that 11 days ago Eleanor's estate attorney had raised the subject of amending her trust, and that he had ended the meeting and left the building. He said Eleanor had offered to pay for the genetic test, and he had paid for it himself, $490, and that he had the receipt in his truck if anyone would like to see it, because a man in his position learns early to keep receipts. Then he said, more quietly, that he had agreed to meet her for exactly one reason, which was that he had spent his whole life not knowing whether he had been given away by someone who wanted him or someone who did not, and that he had wanted the answer before his daughter was old enough to ask him for it. Eleanor confirmed every word. She said she had begged him to accept a portion of her holdings, and he had refused twice in writing. She said she had offered to announce him publicly, and he had asked her not to. She said that on the night after their second meeting, he had sent her a photograph of his daughter's science fair project, and nothing else. No request, no signature, just the photograph, and that she had looked at it for an hour. Victoria had nowhere left to put her theory. The gold digger she needed him to be would not fit inside a man who had refused a trust amendment and paid for his own laboratory test, and was at that moment still wearing a contractor badge clipped to his jacket. And then the evening turned a second time, which is the turn that actually mattered, because Preston Kingsley finally spoke. He said, "Pierce Operations." He said it the way people say a word they have been chasing for an hour. He asked, "You are Nolan Pierce?" Nolan said he was. Preston said that his fund had spent 5 months in the spring trying to hire a firm to remediate a portfolio of 11 distressed resort properties in Arizona and Florida that his diligence team had produced a shortlist with exactly one name on it, and that the man on it had turned them down because he did not have the capacity to do it properly and would not take money to do it badly. Preston looked at Victoria and said, "We could not get a meeting with him. You put him next to the water pitchers." Marissa Caldwell then did something I have thought about many times since, which was to reach into her own bag and place a folder on the table. She said that the Governance and Operations Subcommittee had, in June, opened a nomination file for an outside seat on the Operations Advisory Committee, and that 3 of the 4 members had independently proposed the same candidate, and that the candidate's name was in that folder, and that she had drafted the letter of invitation 8 days ago and had been waiting for the Kingsley's signing to send it. She said she had never met the man. She had only read 4 years of remediation reports with his signature on them. She slid the folder across the linen, and the name on the tab was visible to everyone. Victoria had known none of it, because 2 years earlier she had told Daniel Huxley that vendors under a certain contract value were beneath the chief executive's attention, and because in all the time Pierce Operations had been saving her properties, she had never once asked who was doing it. Her own board had been recruiting the man she had just publicly humiliated, on merit, in writing, before anyone alive knew about the envelope. That is the bitter arithmetic of the night, and I want it understood because it is the whole point. The test did not make Nolan Pierce valuable. He had been valuable in the loading dock at 4 in the afternoon and at the small table by the service station at 8. All the paper did was remove Victoria's last excuse for not seeing it. Eleanor said the sentence that I believe will outlive everyone at that table. She held up the torn envelope and said, "This page does not make Nolan worthy of sitting with us. It only proves that you needed a page before you would look at him like a person." Victoria did not respond. Her wine had not been touched since the first toast. Daniel Huxley was looking at his hands with the expression of a man realizing that his own careful survival had been part of the machinery. And Nolan, who had every right to enjoy that moment, did not appear to enjoy it at all. He looked tired, and he looked at his phone, where there was a message from a 15-year-old asking whether he was coming home. Victoria believed the worst had passed. It had not. Preston Kingsley set his leather folder squarely in front of him and closed the flap over the signature tabs, and the small sound of that clasp was the loudest thing in the room. He said, "Before we sign anything tonight, I think we need to talk about how this company decides who counts." Nothing theatrical followed. Nobody applauded, no security escorted anyone anywhere, and Victoria Blackwell was not removed from her position at that table, because that is not how consequences actually arrive for people with a 31% owner in the family and $400 million in motion. What happened instead was slower and considerably worse for her. Preston explained, in the flat, courteous register of a man who has ended many deals politely, that his fund's diligence on Blackwell had 2 open items, and that only one of them was financial. The other was leadership culture, which he said his investment committee had begun weighting heavily after 2 bad experiences with founder-run hospitality groups. He said he had come to dinner in order to close that item. He said he now had a great deal of data. Victoria said it was a misunderstanding. She said she had been protecting the integrity of a sensitive evening, that she had not known the circumstances, that she would of course apologize, and that a single social error should not be mistaken for a governance risk. Marissa Caldwell answered her before Preston could. She said, "No." She said, "You understood perfectly what you were doing. You simply misjudged who he was." And that distinction, spoken by a woman who had spent 30 years on boards, went through the room like a change in air pressure, because it was exact. Victoria had not slipped. She had not confused a name or forgotten an invitation. She had made a deliberate decision to move a man out of sight, and the only thing that had gone wrong with the decision was the identity of the man. Eleanor spoke next, and she surprised everybody again because she took her own hands off the scale. She announced that she would not use a single one of her voting rights to place Nolan anywhere inside Blackwell Hospitality. She said that if he ever held a position in this company, it would be because the board had voted for him on his record, and that she would recuse herself from that vote entirely and put the recusal in writing that night. She said she had spent 40 years living with the consequence of a family deciding a person's life for their own convenience, and she was not going to inaugurate her son's place in it the same way. Marissa said that was the correct answer. Nolan said nothing, but something in his shoulders came down half an inch, because a man who has built everything himself does not want a gift disguised as justice. Nolan then said his own piece, and it was not the speech anyone expected. He said he did not want Victoria fired. He said it plainly, and I watched 3 people at that table check his face for irony and fail to find any. He said that removing her would feel excellent for approximately 1 week and would teach her nothing, that 1,100 employees depended on the continuity of that office, and that he had spent his career fixing systems rather than replacing people, because replacing people is what companies do when they cannot bear to examine themselves. But then he said that Pierce Operations would not renew its master services agreement under the current terms, and he laid out what he required instead, and each item landed like a nail going in straight. He required a transparent vendor qualification process published to every property, so that no operator's access depended on which manager happened to like him. He required that any firm engaged on a crisis remediation report directly to the Operations Advisory Committee, because the party being audited should not control the auditor's calendar. He required that at any Blackwell meeting, staff and contractors receive the same seating, materials, and speaking order as employees, written down, because unwritten courtesy is only permission that can be withdrawn. And he required that operational decisions be resolved on evidence, with dissent recorded, including his own. Marissa Caldwell was writing while he talked. Preston Kingsley said, "That is a governance framework." Nolan said it was a vendor agreement, and that he had been trying to get someone in that building to read it for 2 years. Then came the moment I would replay if I could only keep one. The service captain, who had been standing near the kitchen doors for 20 minutes trying to become furniture, finally approached Eleanor because someone had to, and he asked, very carefully, whether she would like him to bring an additional chair for Mr. Pierce. Eleanor said, no. Victoria's chin lifted a 1/4 inch, because for 1 second she thought her mother was conceding something, that the family would keep its shape and the evening would be tidied away. Eleanor turned in her seat, looked at the empty space at the foot of the table where the linen was still smooth, and said, "Bring Nolan's chair back to where it was." And then she added, "And the place card too. It is in that woman's apron." The card came out of the apron pocket a little bent at one corner. The captain smoothed it against his forearm and set it down on the primary table, and the chair came back from the wall, and it made the small scraping sound that chairs make, and in a silent room it went on for a very long time. Nolan Pierce walked over and sat down in it. Nobody objected. Preston Kingsley poured him a glass of water himself and passed it across, which was, in the grammar of that particular world, a considerable statement. Victoria Blackwell watched her half-brother sit 6 feet away from her at her own dinner and could not think of one thing to say that she would not have regretted, so, for the first time that night she said nothing at all, and it was probably the wisest decision she made. The guests left before 10. Preston Kingsley shook Eleanor's hand, told Nolan he would be calling him within the week about Arizona, regardless of what happened with the Blackwell agreement, and departed without signing anything. The $420 million did not evaporate. It went into suspension, which in some ways is more expensive, because suspension has a smell that other investors can detect. The board convened a special session 11 days later. Nobody was dismissed. Nobody stormed out. 3 resolutions passed, and they were dry and small, and they rearranged Victoria Blackwell's professional life more thoroughly than a firing would have. The first commissioned an independent leadership assessment of the chief executive, with the findings reported to the full board and reviewed annually. The second removed vendor qualification and crisis engagement authority from the chief executive's office and placed it under the Operations Advisory Committee. The third appointed Marissa Caldwell to lead a governance review with a mandate to examine how information had been permitted to stop at the level of Daniel Huxley for 2 years. Victoria remained chief executive of Blackwell Hospitality Group. She simply did so while being examined, which anyone who has held real authority will tell you is a form of pain that being fired mercifully ends. She asked to see Nolan alone before the special session. They met in a coffee shop in Hoboken that she had to look up, and she arrived in a very expensive coat and sat on a wooden chair that wobbled, and she began the way most people begin. She said, "If I had known you were," and Nolan put his cup down and said, "That is the problem." She stopped. He asked her a question then that she was not prepared for, and it was 7 words long. He said, "And what if I were nobody?" She opened her mouth. He waited. He waited long enough that the espresso machine cycled twice, and she did not produce an answer, because there wasn't one that she could say out loud in a coffee shop to a man she had seated by the water pitchers. He told her he did not want an apology for the humiliation, because an apology delivered to a newly discovered brother is just an apology to a bloodline. He said the apology that would mean something was owed to a captain in a black vest who had to choose between his job and his decency, and to a housekeeping supervisor in Chicago who had been overruled 11 times before someone finally listened to her about the laundry chutes, and to whoever the next man in the wrong jacket turned out to be. He said he had been that man in 19 different buildings, and that he had learned to read the exact moment a person decided he was furniture. Victoria sat with her hands around a paper cup and felt, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely ashamed, and not because Nolan had turned out to be powerful. That is the part I want understood, because it is the only redemption available to a person like her, and it is thin and it is real. She was ashamed because she understood that if the laboratory result had come back negative, she would have gone home that night believing she had handled the evening correctly. The paper had not changed her conduct. It had merely removed her ability to keep the belief comfortable. She said that to him, out loud, in a wobbly chair, which took more courage than anything she had done at the table. Nolan did not absolve her. He said, "Good," and then he said that he would work with her, that he expected her to be difficult, and that he would tell her when she was. It was not forgiveness. It was terms, and terms are what people can actually keep. His conversation with Eleanor came later, in her apartment on 63rd Street, where she made tea badly because she had never in her life made it for herself. He did not call her mom. He called her Eleanor, and she did not flinch or correct him, or fill the silence with permission she had no right to grant. She apologized, and she did it without arranging the blame into a comfortable shape. She did not say her father made her, though he had, and she did not say the era was different, though it was. She said that she had been 19 and frightened, and that she had signed her name, that her hand had held the pen, and that she had spent 40 years deciding that she was not allowed to look for him, which was a decision she made every single day rather than one she made once. Nolan told her about the machinist and the school secretary who raised him deliberately because he wanted her to know that the 11 minutes she had held him were not the end of the story. He told her his father could hear a bearing going bad from across a room, and that his mother had made him rewrite a college essay 6 times. He said he had a good life and that she had missed it, and that both of those things were true at once. Then he said the sentence that closed the ledger without pretending it balanced. "I cannot give you back 40 years, he said, "but maybe we can decide what we do with whatever number is left." Eleanor put her cup down and said yes, and then they talked about hotels for 2 hours because that was easier, and it was also enough. 7 months later, Blackwell Hospitality signed with Kingsley Partners at a slightly lower valuation and with 2 governance covenants written into the agreement, one of which was Nolan's vendor framework, almost word for word. Victoria was still chief executive. She had not transformed into a gentle woman. She was sharp, impatient, and occasionally still audibly unimpressed with people, but there was now a half-second of hesitation before the worst version of a sentence left her mouth. And in that half-second, she usually chose differently. Marissa Caldwell called it the most improvement she had ever seen from an executive who had not been fired. Daniel Huxley took early retirement in the spring, and on his last day he sent Nolan a 2-line email apologizing for 2 years of silence, and Nolan wrote back that he understood, because he did. Nolan Pierce joined the Operations Advisory Committee that autumn by a vote of 9-0, with Eleanor Blackwell recorded as recused, exactly as she had promised in writing on a torn envelope's worst night. He did not take a Blackwell title or any portion of the family holdings, or the surname anyone kept quietly offering him. Pierce Operations grew to 31 employees and finally took the Arizona portfolio. And in November, in a small apartment with no press and no board members, Lila Pierce met her grandmother over a roast chicken that Eleanor had ordered rather than cooked, and asked her approximately 400 questions about 1982, and Eleanor answered every one of them, which was the only apology that was ever going to matter. There was one more dinner in that same restaurant on the 54th floor, a year on, and I would not mention it except that a room can be haunted and then unhaunted. Nolan came up in a decent suit this time, though his shoes were still the ones that had been in the mechanical room, because he was not a man who bought new shoes to make a point. There was a card on the primary table beside the chief executive seat with his name printed on it, and it had been placed there by an administrator who had no idea any of this had ever happened, which is how you know a rule has become a habit. Victoria saw him crossing the room and stood up. Then she pulled the chair out herself. Not because of a laboratory report, which by then nobody at Blackwell discussed. Not because of stock, since he held none. Not because Eleanor was watching, because Eleanor was in Charleston that week and had missed her flight. Nolan Pierce said thank you and sat down and asked her how the Charleston conversion was tracking, and she told him the truth, including the part that was going badly, which 2 years earlier she would have hidden from a man she considered a vendor. He looked once at the long white table that had been used on a February evening to sort human beings into those who counted and those who did not. It was linen over wood. It held plates. That was all it had ever been. The genetic test proved that Nolan Pierce belonged to the Blackwell family. But Victoria had to learn something much harder than that, and it took her a year and a suspended deal and a wobbly chair in Hoboken to learn it. He had never needed to carry her blood in order to deserve being treated with respect.